Good morning and welcome to Law Talks here on 4CRB. Well, we all make purchases expecting things to work the way they should, whether it's a car, a fridge, or even booking a service like home renovations. But what happens when something goes wrong? Maybe the product doesn't last, the quality isn't what you expected, or the business just isn't doing the job they promised. It can be incredibly frustrating, especially once you've handed over your money. And often we're talking about big purchases that people have saved for. A lot of people aren't quite sure what their rights are or where to turn to next. So to help us break it all down, we're joined by commercial litigation lawyer James Griffin from Attwood Marshall Lawyers. Thanks for joining us this morning, James.
Thanks for having me.
Well, James, whether it's a car, a fridge, or even something like home renovations or installing solar panels, most of us have had something go wrong after a big purchase. When that happens, where do people even start?
That's a great question. As a general statement, the best place to start is to keep a contemporaneous paper trail. So that might look like receipts, contracts, or any sort of communication records which might shed light on the interaction or the transaction and how it's gone wrong. As a general statement, issues with big purchases, whether they're goods or services, fall within the Australian Consumer Law, which is contained within Schedule 2 of the Competition and Consumer Act. The Australian Consumer Law has been around since about 2011 and is a piece of Commonwealth legislation, meaning that it applies in all states and territories and generally covers most everyday purchases and transactions that an ordinary consumer might make.
And what basic protections do consumers have when they buy goods or services in Australia?
So when you buy goods or services in Australia, they must meet certain standards. These are non-negotiable and apply automatically and can't be contracted out of. Now, the ACL is really broad in terms of the range of protections that it offers consumers. We call these consumer guarantees. In relation to goods, the most common guarantees are that the good is of acceptable quality. So is it safe, durable and free from defects, and is it fit for purpose? In relation to the supply of services, the main guarantees are that the service is performed with due care and skill, that the service is fit for a particular purpose, and that the service will be delivered within a reasonable time frame. The list of goods and services to which the ACL applies is very wide, but as a general rule of thumb, in order for the protections of the ACL to apply, the good or service typically has to be acquired for some personal, domestic or household use, and in that instance, the consumer is generally entitled to rely upon the guarantees that we've just discussed.
Now, James, a lot of people get told, and this has happened to me, they get told to go to the manufacturer. Do you always go back to where you brought the item from if there's a problem?
Yeah, so as a first step, consumer guarantees under the ACL generally apply to the supplier of the good or service. In some cases, the supplier and the manufacturer are one and the same, so it really depends on the problem and the remedy that you're seeking. A great example is a car dealership. So sometimes the dealership that sells you the car is different from the manufacturer of the car. So that's where it can be a little hairy. But generally, your first point of call for any failure to meet a specific guarantee is with the supplier of the good. And then if that doesn't work, sometimes you can have a cause of action against the manufacturer, but the remedies are limited.
Okay. And we often hear about major and minor faults. What's the difference and why does it matter?
So the primary difference is that a major defect or a major fault renders the good or service inoperative. So for example, in the context of cars, a major fault would necessitate the car being unusable, undrivable or unsafe. A minor fault is something that can be repaired within a reasonable time.
And can a consumer actually insist on a refund rather than just accepting a repair or ongoing repairs?
So it really depends upon whether it is a major or minor defect. If it's a major defect, the consumer can elect to have a refund, a replacement or a repair. They make that election. Whereas when it's a minor defect, they can only request a repair, and that has to happen within a reasonable time.
And we often hear about issues with cars, as we were talking about, but it can also be things like major appliances breaking down, solar systems not working as promised, or even home renovations going wrong. When we're talking about these bigger ticket items, how do consumer rights apply? And what are some of the common situations you're seeing?
So consumer guarantees apply regardless of the price of the good or service that's provided in circumstances where it's acquired for personal, domestic or household use. That's really the threshold question.
Okay.
Another type of protection that we haven't touched on is general protection. So that's your misleading and deceptive conduct, unconscionable conduct, or unfair contract terms. These might also apply to home renovations, like you mentioned, or solar systems, where the supplier of the good or service has made some sort of representation to you, and that turns out to be false or misleading, or where there's a term in the contract that you've signed that's unreasonable or unfair. But one of the most common situations we're seeing at the moment is breaches of consumer guarantees in relation to the purchase of cars, caravans and other motor vehicles. A good example might be that a person purchases a brand new vehicle which is under warranty. 6 months later, the vehicle has a number of defects that need to be fixed, but the car dealership is showing a reluctance to do that under warranty. In that sort of situation, we might have to step in and deal with the dealership directly and assist in advocating for your rights under the Australian consumer law.
And if something you've purchased keeps failing, or the business isn't responding or is refusing to help, what should someone do next, especially if a lot of money is involved?
My general advice would always be to try and resolve your dispute directly with the supplier of the good or service before seeking to escalate the dispute. The reason that I always recommend this is that sometimes it can prompt a meaningful response without needing to put yourself to the time, effort and stress of pursuing the matter further. It also gives the supplier of the good a chance to respond, and that way you've been reasonable, you understand their position, and you can make an informed decision about what those next steps might look like.
And for people who are hesitant to take things further, is it expensive or complicated to enforce your rights?
What I really urge consumers to do in relation to ACL disputes is to weigh up the commerciality of pursuing their matter. In some instances, the nature and extent of the breaches are such that it is worth pursuing, but in other cases, it can be a very costly exercise. Only 3 to 5% of all litigated matters in Australia actually make it to a final hearing in a court, and that's because most disputes are resolved without the need for a court or tribunal intervention. My recommendation is to always seek legal advice early to help clarify what your rights are, what options are available to you, and what the costs might look like of pursuing it. That way you can make an informed decision. If you do wish to pursue the matter further, the forum in which that can take place really depends upon the type of dispute. For example, some small consumer guarantee matters can be dealt with in the Civil and Administrative Tribunal, while other more complex disputes, such as misleading and deceptive conduct, are dealt with in conventional courts.
Yeah, okay. And if listeners take one thing away from today's discussion, James, what's the biggest mistake people make when dealing with a faulty product or service?
The biggest mistake that people make when dealing with a faulty good or service is to not understand what their rights are. If I was to recommend one thing to all listeners here today, it would be to familiarise yourself with your rights under the ACL. So the next time you're in a situation where you're dealing with the supplier of a good or service and that good or service is faulty or not up to the standard that you expect, you're able to communicate effectively, and hopefully that resolves your dispute without the need to escalate it any further.
Well, James, that's all we have time for today. Some valuable advice there, and a great reminder that as consumers, we do have rights, especially when it comes to those bigger purchases. A big thank you to James Griffin from Attwood Marshall Lawyers for helping us make sense of consumer disputes. Thanks for your time this morning, James.
Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to Law Talks here on 4CRB, which you can hear every Friday morning from 9 o'clock.